Hello.
Hello, how are you?
Great. Thank you.
Good. Thanks for being here. We'll get started about 12 o'clock.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks.
Hey everybody, it is about time for us to get started now, so we'll go ahead and kick things off. Welcome to ATEG's first webinar event of our summer 2020 webinar series. I'm really excited to be sharing with you today the ideas and the topics and the concepts that Mariem, Bemmerzouk, and I are going to present. We are talking today about culturally relevant grammar and writing instruction. It's a topic that is extremely relevant, extremely important, and extremely meaningful in education in general, and especially in today's society. And we are thrilled to have this opportunity to talk with you about this. As you can see on the bottom of that slide there, we have a hashtag thanks to Nick Manuel, who's provided us with a great idea for a hashtag for our webinar series. So hashtag ATEG 2020, live tweeting is encouraged. Feel free to hop on Twitter, live tweet, hashtag it ATEG 2020. We'll check it afterwards, we'll respond, we'll engage, we'll send some memes, some GIFs, whatever you like, we're down. So our big questions for today, the things we're going to talk about, we're considering the key components of culturally relevant teaching. What are the major attributes of culturally relevant teaching? What makes it what it is? And then that logically extends to our next question. Why is it so important to effective educational practice? Why is culturally relevant teaching so significant and so important to effective teaching? And then, given that this is an ATEG session, we're thinking about its application to grammar and writing instruction. So once we've talked about the key attributes of culturally relevant teaching, thinking about its significance and its importance, then we're going to look at specific ways and ideas and suggestions for applying it to grammar and writing instruction. We'll begin with an overview of culturally relevant teaching. Then we'll talk about its significance, its impact on teaching and learning. After that, we'll look at its current relevance. This is definitely an issue that is very much at play in education and society today, so we'll think about that. Then we'll talk about how, now that we understand that background and the importance and the relevance of this instructional approach, how can we connect it to effective grammar and writing instruction? And then as we consider that, we're thinking on an even larger scale of how can we use culturally relevant teaching in the inquiry that's associated with it to center our students in the curriculum? How can we use that to empower and engage our students and help them feel at the center of the curriculum, their experiences teaching and learning? That'll take us about a half hour, maybe a little bit more, and then we'll have some time after that for questions and discussion. We'll do the questions through the chat box. So once we get to that point, I'll send a chat saying asking for volunteers to ask questions, and then you can share yours through the chat, and then Mariem and I can respond to them. So with that said, I will turn it over to my fantastic co-presenter, Mariem Bemmerzouk, who will get us started with our work today.
Hi, everybody. My name is Mariem Bemmerzouk. I'm a rising senior at Longwood University. My studies are liberal studies with a concentration in early elementary education. I've always had a passion for social justice, equality and equity, and also education and teaching. So I'm really excited to be part of this webinar where I can combine the two. So let's start with the first broad question, which is, what is culturally relevant teaching? So it's also known as culturally responsive teaching, and both can be defined as using cultural characteristics, experiences, and perspectives of ethnically diverse students as conduits for teaching them more effectively. Gloria Ladson-Billings, who is known for playing a prominent role in the promotion of culturally relevant teaching, has said that culturally relevant pedagogy rests on 3 criteria. And they are: students must experience academic success, students must develop and or maintain cultural competence, and students must develop a critical consciousness through which they change the status quo of current social order. So what does this mean? So culturally relevant teaching is a student-centered approach, and a student-centered approach is where students express what they're interested in learning, and they also play a role in planning, implementation, and other classroom decisions. So this allows for the incorporation of students' lives, cultures, likes and dislikes, perspectives and passions, all to be included into the classroom as well as the curriculum. And this can be really important for our Black and Brown students who also oftentimes feel forgotten about in the classroom. So what does this look like? Of course, on our webinar, we're talking about in grammar instruction and in English classes specifically, but culturally relevant teaching can be integrated into all subjects, and it's up to the teacher to use their creativity to get information from their students, and in turn, find ways they can add it to math, science, history, and English in all subjects. For example, if a teacher were to say, everybody bring in recipes from your favorite home-cooked meal, and we're gonna implement it into a math subject with fractions, for example. That could be a great way to implement it in math subjects. And it can also be as minimal as just the teacher using student vocabulary just to make it more comfortable with students. Another thing to keep in mind is the effective and respectful ways to get information from your students to discover their cultures. So teachers can do things such as have open discussions in their classroom with their students. At the beginning of the year, teachers can do interviews to learn their students' hobbies, likes, and dislikes. And teachers can give out questionnaires or surveys, all which can be great ways to find out information. But one thing to remember as teachers is that we should never assume the likes and dislikes of our students. When you do this, it can feed into hurtful and negative stereotypes, and we never want that to happen in our classroom because we do want a safe and comfortable environment for our students. So we need to remember to always let them tell us what they like. We never want to put them in a box. We want them to tell us who they are and what their culture is, what they enjoy. So moving on to the next slide, there are lots of positive impacts of implementing culturally relevant teaching into the classroom. So the first is impact on learning. So this is directed towards the students more. So first, to begin, we'll just start with student empowerment, confidence, and growth. When students see themselves and their culture in the curriculum and in their classroom, they feel a sense of pride and a direct connection to what they're learning. And this also has a deeper connection to their curriculum. Students are more engaged and eager to learn when their culture is valued and connected to their curriculum and classroom. We all know that it's human nature to be more connected and interested in ideas and topics that's relevant to you in your life. So when we do that, it really helps the students connect deeper to the curriculum. It also improves attendance as well as GPA. There's actually a study in San Francisco of about 1,400 students that were enrolled in courses that highlighted cultural affirmation. They had much higher attendance and GPA than peers that didn't take these courses, and that directly goes back to the deeper connection to curriculum. If somebody's more invested, they're going to show up and they're going to put more effort because they feel a connection to what they're learning. It also strengthens students' racial and ethnicity identities. With culturally relevant teaching, students are explicitly expressing who they are and what their culture is, and this self-reflection can deeper discover themselves as well as their culture. It also encourages critical thinking, so students are able to self-reflect as well as learn about their peers' cultures, which can also benefit them. It allows them to have a deeper understanding of different worldviews, which can spark curiosity among the students and also allow them to engage in the world around them. And lastly, peers are able to learn about new cultures and ways of life that they probably wouldn't if we didn't have this in our classrooms. And probably the biggest impact on learning is bridging the gap. So for many students, specifically students of color, they can feel a deep disconnect between their school life and their home life. When there's no reflection of themselves in what they're learning, they can kind of get the sense that they're not meant to learn this, it's not important in their life to learn this, which as teachers we know is not the case. We want all of our students to learn this important information. But when you don't see yourself directly in the curriculum or see anything near who you are, then it can kind of feel like a disconnect between you and what you're learning. So by having culturally relevant teaching in our classrooms, we can bridge the gap between their home life and their class content and make them one big thing in their life rather than two separate, very distant aspects of their life. There's also impacts on teaching. So to begin, there's a greater connection with students. When you do things like the interviews that I was talking about, or the surveys, you find so much more information from them than just if you were to go throughout the year and not ask them questions about who they are. So you do get a deeper connection of what their home life is like, what they're interested in, what their passions are. And this also in turn creates a more comfortable and safe and also engaging classroom environment. As educators, we learn in school that the number one thing you want to have in your classroom is an engaging, comfortable, safe place for people to learn. So by knowing one another, knowing what we like, knowing what we don't like, we can have a harmonious classroom that's comfortable and safe for everybody. It also broadens the views and cultural competence of educators. As educators, we promise to promote lifelong learning, and that should also be true for ourselves. So when you come in contact with a student of a culture you've never experienced, never had to talk to, don't know much about, it can help you learn if you're willing to have their culture be elevated and celebrated in your classroom. It also allows for the improvement of educators' allyship with students. Allyship is the process of constantly building relationships based on trust, accountability, and understanding with minority and marginalized groups. Again, we promote lifelong learning, and that should be true for ourselves. Allies raise the voices of minority and marginalized groups, which also pairs with the student choices of what they want to learn. So we want to elevate their voices. And we should always be willing to learn about new cultures and ways to uplift their voices and who they are. And also it ends the practice of colorblindness. I know a lot of times in the education field, we hear the phrase, "I don't see color," when talking about our students. This can actually deny experiences lived by people, especially people of color, and we don't want to do that. It's okay that we're not the same colors. We don't have to minimalize that and mute that. We should actually celebrate it, celebrate our differences, and acknowledge them in the classroom to validate our students and make them feel that they feel seen and that we know who they are, not just saying, oh, we're all the same color, because that's not true. We're not all the same people. We're very different, and we come from different lives. We have different cultures, religions, beliefs, but we should make them seen instead of just muted. So what is the importance of culturally relevant teaching in today's society? Well, as a country, we are known as the melting pot, and this is becoming more and more true as the years go by. There is an increase of minority students in the United States, as you can tell from the graph on the right. However, even with these changes in demographics among students, in the 2017 to 2018 school year, 79% of public school teachers were white, and similarly, 76% of public school teachers were female. This alone can be problematic, but it can also be problematic when talking about understanding the students. So the difference in representation can really have a disconnect between the learners and the teachers. By implementing culturally relevant pedagogy, the educators can end the disconnect between them, the students, and the curriculum. Again, it's okay to be a white female educator as long as you're aware of your biases and you're aware that the classroom is a safe place for people to be who they are and bring their culture, not leave them at the door. And then another importance in today's society is producing the next generation of active and empowered citizens. In the last few months, we have seen Generation Z standing for oppression, against oppression and racism that we see in our society. This could be accredited to the celebration of diversity that we've been seeing in recent years in our society. When you use culturally relevant practices with students, they realize that their voice does matter and that they can make a difference in their world. And this goes back to my previous statements that culturally relevant teaching in classroom allows for students to have better critical thinking skills and better problem solving skills. And as Ms. Billings has once said, through culturally relevant teaching, students develop a broader socio-political consciousness that allows them to critique the cultural norms, values, and institutions that produce and maintain social inequalities. So overall, when we give them their voice and we let them express who they are, they're gonna in turn go and help the world and make it more accepting for everybody to feel welcome and validated in our world.
So thanks, Mariem. Such fantastic insights into the importance and the key attributes of culturally relevant teaching. So fantastic ideas for us to think about and reflect on as we really consider the importance of this concept and what it can look like in our classrooms. Connecting this and transitioning this to thinking about looking at grammar and writing specific practices. As part of that conversation, what I really want to do is just build off of all of the fantastic insights that Mariem has already presented in a way that just kind of connects them to some classroom work that I've done and some ways to think about how we as writing and literacy and grammar teachers can put all of that fantastic conceptual frameworks and all of those really important insights into the significance of this practice into action in the grammar and writing classroom. As part of that, what I want to do now is share with you some work that I did as part of another project I did on culturally relevant teaching, where I went into 5th grade and 8th grade and 10th grade classes and did a project that I'll talk about now that I would call the Grammar Inquiry Project. We'll talk about its specific components and the instructional steps related to it. But before we get into that, just some key concepts that undergirded that kind of work. One author who has written a lot about insights related to student-centered and culturally relevant teaching that's really made an impact on me is somebody named Jamila Lyascott. If you're not familiar with her book, Black Appetite, White Food, I really encourage you to check it out. It's a must read. It has really important ideas. And one of the things that she presents that you can see reflected in this, the figure on the top left there, she talks about how it's important as teachers when we use practices like the ones that Mariem described, that we create space for our students' identities and our students' voices. One thing that Lyascott brings up that I think is really important, it was important for my development as an educator, and I think it's important for all of us to think about, is that we as teachers don't give our students voice. Saying that is actually quite paternalistic because it suggests that we as teachers can give voice to our students. Our students have voice, Lyascott says. What our job is to create opportunities, to create space for them to share that voice, create a student-centered, culturally relevant classroom where they can express ideas, experiences, identities that are meaningful and valuable to them. When we do that, when we create that space, we're creating opportunities for students to make connections to funds of knowledge. Funds of knowledge basically are forms of insights and awarenesses and intelligences that we've developed through our identities and through our lived experiences. And a lot of culturally relevant teaching, a lot of great culturally relevant teaching practices creates opportunities for students to incorporate their own funds of knowledge. And we'll look at some examples of that in just a minute. And then by doing so, what we're doing is creating an opportunity for students to have this relevance in the curriculum, as Mariem described, to create this bridge so that students aren't seeing these two things, what they do in school and what they do in every other part of their life, as completely separate. Really, language and grammar and writing instruction that is completely separate from students' out of school lives is an oppressive practice because it doesn't provide students with opportunities to feel seen and feel recognized. It doesn't privilege their own identities and lived experiences. So to challenge those kinds of oppressive practices that don't value our students' individualities and identities and funds of knowledge, we can create that bridge and we can establish connections and relevance and levels of relevance to students' out of school lives. So the project that I worked on with these different groups of students to focus on this is just one example of what such a practice can look like. I really encourage you to think about this in connection to your own practice, but also really to think about ways that you could incorporate similar kinds of concepts and ideas, all of the insights that Mariem shared in the background and the importance, and incorporate that into your instruction. This is just one way that could look. I mean, this is a way that worked for me, but as you incorporate that into your own instruction, think about what best works for you and what best works for your students. So thinking about grammar specifically, in some ways, grammar has some challenges with thinking about culturally relevant teaching, and that, it can be in the first step, it can say, okay, well, how am I going to do that with grammar? There are these grammar rules and concepts. But when we think about it even further, and when we reflect on really what grammar and language is, it actually lends itself really, really well. Because like in this project that I did with my students, the main goal of the project was for students to, after they learned certain grammatical concepts, to think about how those grammatical concepts are relevant and present and significant to texts they encounter in their everyday lives. And those texts are by definition using a wide range of examples. Those texts could be social media posts, they could be conversations, they could be books they read, they could be articles they read, they could really be kind of anything in between. And they could, through looking at all of those different examples, students can see, oh, hey, I learned this grammatical concept. Like I learned about prepositional phrases or strong verbs or connotation rich language, whatever that might be. And once they've learned that in school, then they can move to that next step of creating that bridge between that concept that they learned in school and their own lives. I really intentionally use that term that the students create the bridge, because I think that's a really important component of it. The students are the ones who can really identify what it is that represents their out of school lives. As Mariem indicated earlier, it's so important that we as teachers don't stereotype, don't generalize, don't essentialize, don't say, oh, well, I think this student is going to like this. Let that come from the student, and let the student be the one who identifies the experience or the identity or the background that is really representative of who they identify with and what they identify with as their out of school lives, their experiences, and their identities. So through this concept, through this project, what I did was, after students had learned these different grammatical tools, grammatical concepts, I showed them some examples of these concepts used in authentic situations. And those authentic situations, that part of it was really me modeling. That was me modeling things that mattered to me, a text that I engaged with in my out of school life, and examples of those grammatical concepts in that text. And then after I showed them those examples, we talked together about the importance of those concepts. So we discussed, okay, so here we saw this strong verb in this text, or this prepositional phrase in this text. Why is that important? After that, then I asked students to do this work on their own, kind of release the responsibility or the ownership to them, and ask them to find examples of grammatical concepts that they studied in school in texts that represented their out of school lives, and think a little bit about the significance of those concepts. Why were they used? What was their impact? How did it really make a difference in the effectiveness of the piece? Once students did that, then they shared their findings. They celebrated the work that they did, and they said, okay, one concept we studied was this one. Well, I found some examples of it in this text that I encountered in my out of school life. And this is the impact that it had. This is why that particular grammatical concept was important to that article or that conversation or that song lyric or that social media post or whatever it is that the students engaged with. And then after they completed those 4 instructional steps, I asked the students to reflect on those experiences, to think about, first, what kind of impact did this have on your learning of the concept, but also how is it a little bit different or similar, if it was, to other in-school activities that you did? Did you have similar experiences in school? And if so, what were they like? And if not, what was different about this one? So let's go through some specific examples, and I'll share with you some student insights and some specific texts or ideas that they shared. So just to talk a little bit further about that first step. When you do this as a teacher, when you talk with students about authentically used grammatical concepts that matter to you, again, the idea with doing that is that you're modeling this process for them. You're not co-opting it. You're not saying, okay, I found this song lyric that has this, so I want you to use the same song lyric. What you're doing is saying, hey, here's something that I engage with outside of school. my students that I worked with in some of these projects, for example, they knew that I'm a big fan of Pittsburgh sports team. So I would bring in articles about like Steelers and the Pirates and the Penguins and find examples of things like strong verbs and prepositional phrases, things like that, that represented those grammatical concepts that we talked about. And again, in doing so, what I was really modeling was just the process of finding authentic texts that were relevant to me and showing students, hey, here's something I engage with in my own time. This is what it looked like for me when I found examples of these grammatical concepts in there, just so you can kind of talk them through it. It's a bit of a think aloud in a sense, and you're showing them, hey, this is what this really looks like. Once students have done that, or once you've shared that information with your students, what you can do then is have a conversation with them about the importance of that grammatical concept. So whatever concept you found in whatever text you found, once you've identified those for students, say, hey, we've been talking a lot about strong verbs. Here's an example of one and something that I've read outside of school. Then you can have this conversation with them. Why do you think that's important? Why do you think the author of this piece or the songwriter or whatever that particular genre might be, why do you think that individual chose to use that specific grammatical concept? How would this text be different if it didn't have that grammatical concept used in it? And through that conversation, what we're really doing as teachers is we're walking students through this metacognitive process. We're helping them develop this awareness of what are grammatical concepts really? What are they like in the real world? Why do people choose to use them? So these are things in reality that we and our students and really anyone else who engages in text and language does. But part of what we're doing here and looking at how these things are used in out-of-school situations is we're kind of taking the veil back on that. We're saying, hey, let's look at exactly what's going on. Let's kind of get behind the curtain with this. And let's see, okay, this author of this particular piece about a hockey game used this particular strong verb. Why? Or in this particular song, there's a prepositional phrase. Why do you think it's there? What does it tell us? And through that conversation, students can then see, okay, we learned about these things in school, we developed the fundamentals, now we're applying it to more authentic situations. So after you've modeled that with students, released more of the responsibility of having that conversation with them about it, then you can release more of the responsibility to them. And what that looks like is asking students to find authentic examples on their own. So basically at this stage, the students are looking for any kind of texts that are authentic to them. You can see it says there examples from their own lives in any out-of-school context. And I really emphasize that when I talk with students about this, that the idea here is that whether it's a text, whether it's something you saw on an Instagram caption, whether it's a song you listened to, an article you read, anything else like that, think about how that represents basically the tools of good writing, and look for these kinds of grammatical tools or these grammatical concepts that we've discussed. And if you find one, think about it. Think about why it's important. Why do you think whoever wrote this piece chose to use that? That can really center students in the curriculum. It can create a curricular structure that focuses not just on certain rules, which a lot of grammar instruction unfortunately can sometimes become just memorizing rules. Students can learn rules, that's important, but they need to, after that, really apply them. And that application should be student-centered and should be culturally relevant, should be individualized to the students. So when students do this, they're engaging with this language that they're interacting with in an out-of-school situation. And they're really conducting their own inquiries. Inquiry-based learning, something that's really hot and popular right now because of how much it privileges and emphasizes students' curiosities, their kinds of questions and their opportunities to get into things that matter to them. Well, this is a way to do that that connects with grammar and language. Help students look for examples of these grammatical concepts and think about why they matter. Think about why they're so important. So once students find these examples and think about their significance, then they can really celebrate that. And I want to share with you some examples of students sharing this kind of work. So when students share the findings that they have, what they can do is through It can be through a presentation, it can be through a written reflection that they share, but in one way or another, I really encourage you to have your students share the findings that they've developed, the ways that they've identified certain grammatical concepts in their out of school lives. So one student, this is a 5th grader, she's working with strong verbs and specific nouns, and she said, I was helping my family make oxtail soup, my sister make oxtail soup, my family has that a lot. I noticed she said a ton of these strong verbs and specific nouns, and then she gives these examples like dice and saute to represent those strong verbs, and then names of specific ingredients to represent the specific nouns. And by doing so, this student made an authentic connection to this particular grammatical concept and said, hey, here's a way that this functions and looks in my real life, and I can share this aspect of my identity and my background in a way that I choose to, and in a way that represents this grammatical concept having a direct connection to my identities and experiences. Another student did some similar work with this, but with a different kind of text. So she was talking about cultural or connotation-rich language. This is a 10th grader, and she was discussing how when she talked with her dad about the girls' varsity basketball team that she made, and her dad, when talking about the coach, said that coach is really wise. He's coached for 20-something years, and he's so wise. And so the student did something that I thought was really insightful and thought-provoking. She talked about wise as the connotation-rich language. And as you can see in that description there, she did a really good job of identifying its denotation, but also thinking in a really developed way about its connotation and how it connects to experience. I like how she says, you wouldn't say a really intelligent kid is wise. You'd use a word with a different connotation. And she talked further then about why that connotation-rich language was so significant to her understanding of her dad's statement about the coach and about the coach's attributes. So when students have shared those kinds of insights, then a great follow-up step, and this is the final step of this process, is to give them the opportunity to think a little bit about this experience. And there are 2 reflection questions that I like to ask students as they've done with this. You can see them on the right-hand side under what can it look like, how can it look in action? First, what did you learn about whatever that focal strategy is, whatever that grammatical concept that they're studying, by looking at and analyzing examples of it in your out of school life? So what did it show you? And then after that, how does it compare to other things you've done in school? And I feel like you can really tell a lot about students' experiences with the project through their responses to those reflection questions. So for example, in response to the thinking about connotation-rich language and examples of it in one's out-of-school life. This is from the student who gave the response about the coach being wise. She said that connotation is something that's used in all parts of communication, and she discusses that specific example. And I like how she also makes these specific connections to how she thinks about it now. She says the words I use when I'm talking with my basketball teammates or when I post on social media are so full of connotation. I'm always trying to use the right connotation for the tone, positive or negative, that I'm trying to create. So to me, what that shows is a really thoughtful and analytical understanding of this concept, and a thoughtful and analytical understanding that applies not just to, say, maybe things she may have been asked to analyze in school, but to her own authentic application and a communication and experience with this. And then a response to that other question about how does it compare to other things you've done in school? This is the same student in her response. She says, it's the first time I've been asked to look for something related to language in my own life. And I think this next comparison that she makes is really interesting. English classes sometimes do things like ask us to write about our lives or compare something in a book to our lives. It's definitely the only time I've looked for a skill or strategy in language from my own life. And then she goes on to say that the material that's learned in school can relate to one's own life, and it creates an opportunity to show that connection. And then that last statement, when I'm looking at examples in a textbook or workbook that a teacher or a book that teacher assigns, I don't get that chance. And I think that's a really important call, basically, for culturally relevant teaching, that as we as teachers create opportunities for our students to engage with content, we should look for ways to engage that content in meaningful, identity-focused ways that incorporate all of those ideas that Mariem presented in introducing this topic and discussing its significance and its importance, thinking about how it builds that bridge and how it allows for students to really feel represented and seen in the curriculum. The way that curricula are often structured is that many students do not feel represented and seen in that curriculum, and we can disrupt that. We can challenge that. We can think about what practices that exist in schools, for example, in language and grammar instruction, don't provide those authentic connections. And we can challenge those and change them to make them into practices that do provide those authentic connections. So when we're doing all of this kind of work, and I know we're coming up close on our time for questions, but when we're incorporating these kinds of insights, what we can do is create this curriculum that has this meaningful relevance to students' lives. And Jamila Eliascott, who I mentioned before with Black Appetite and White Food, one of the things that she asks us to think about is how history will remember our classrooms. And I think that's an especially important insight in today's society. Mariem had that great point earlier about as young people today lead in work for social justice, that can really be connected to culturally relevant teaching, to classroom opportunities to advocate, to think about concepts and issues that matter and are relevant. We can be part of continued progression in that. Today's society is one where it really is incumbent upon us to make efforts for social change and to help our students think about things that their identities and their experiences and how they can be valued in school and represented in school. And we can make those positive steps and those positive efforts through inquiry, through culturally relevant teaching that center our students in our curriculum. So I'll close with a quote from Cornelius Minor, and then just a couple questions for us all to think about moving forward. In his book, We Got This, Cornelius Minor says, sometimes the things we have to do become tradition, and as tradition ages, sometimes those practices do not serve all children. Sometimes we have to change an established way of doing things in order to better serve our kids. And to really make our classrooms as inclusive and as anti-oppressive as possible, but one of the most important things for us to do as part of that is to look carefully and critically at established practices. And if there are things that are oppressive or that are not inclusive, we should identify them, name them, and then we should change them to create opportunities for all of our students to feel represented. As Cornelius Minor says, we should think carefully about what are some established ways of doing things that need to be changed, and we should make those changes. So when we think about this moving forward, applying it to our future work, let's think about things that we are doing in our classrooms that can disrupt instructional practice, oppressive instructional practices in grammar, language, and writing instruction. And then by extension, how can we make our instruction inclusive of our students' identities and our experiences? So those are just some things for us to think about moving forward as we continue to reflect on the impact and the importance of culturally relevant teaching and some specific ways it can look like in our classrooms, in our instruction. So with that said, let's take some time now for any questions people have. So you can share your questions in the chat box, and then Mariem and I can respond to them. Yes, thanks for the question about slides. So this is being recorded, and I'm going to post the recording. I'll email it to everyone and also post it on the ATEG website. But if you would also like a direct copy of this presentation and the slides in that, I'm 100% happy to send you that as well. So I'll just send everybody to the slides, send everybody copies of the slides as well as the recording. Joanna, good question with code switching and working. Absolutely, Joe. Thanks so much for your comment. Joanna, with a great question on code switching and working with students who use a vernacular. Yeah, we can definitely comment on that. Mariem, do you want to start us off with insights on that one?
Yeah, we actually talked about code switching and even ESL students and how they fit in this conversation, and it really does go hand in hand. We want students, whether it is a second language, Spanish, Arabic, whatever it may be, as well as AAVE, to feel welcome in the classroom. And this goes with validating that language is not rigid, and that we use language to communicate, and there's never a wrong way to communicate. Of course, there's a traditional correct English way, but there's never a wrong way to communicate. So I think that can go definitely hand in hand if you wanted to add anything off of that.
Yeah, no, I think that's perfect. And I think the next question that we have, also really aligns with it as well. As we can, and I'll comment on that one too. In what way do you think it's effective to teach the dominant discourse with students' dialect? So really similar to what the question that Mariem just answered. And I'll just add that, when we're thinking about these kinds of ideas, I think it's so important that we don't approach dialects from any sort of deficit perspective, that we look at dialect in a way that, represents just various forms of language that are most applicable for different purposes. And according to the definition of dialect from Wolfram and Schilling Estes, that really we all speak in dialects, that there are certainly dialects that are considered, depending on the terminology you'd like to use, edited American English is one particular terminology for that, that thinking about, it in ways that it is applicable and effective to, do all of those things. I think that the language in the grammar classroom is really rich for those kinds of discussions, to engage students in these conversations. And one thing that I do in the class that I teach on teaching grammar at Longwood University, where I work, and also just with students when I'm doing like K through 12 work, is we'll look at a book and we'll say, okay, look at the kinds of language here. Why do you think the author created a character that communicated in that particular way? And oftentimes students will say something along the lines of, well, if everyone spoke the same way, then it wouldn't be fun to read. People would sound like robots. And when we think about really valuing all forms of language, we can think about how all different forms of language are valuable and how they're really purposeful choices that authors make in different kinds of settings. I know we're already low on time and we have some great questions, so I want to move on to Kevin's. What kinds of work with those grammatical concepts and or the authentic texts did students do after the grammar inquiry project had ended? Kevin, that's a great question. And honestly, I did this as sort of a step in kind of consultant kind of person, but I know that what students did with this and what they continued to do in the classroom was that they continued to think about other grammatical concepts that they continued to learn and applying those to authentic texts, whether those happen to be the same authentic text that maybe they used for this particular activity, for example, the connotation-rich language one, or if it was another text that they felt was most relevant to that particular concept. But I know that that work continued and the students continued to look at different authentic texts that represented grammatical concepts. And it's also important to note as part of that, that students can find grammatical concepts that, we might find the same grammatical concept, but, your different grammatical concepts in the same text. So one text can be a mentor text or an example of a number of meaningful grammatical concepts. Let's just take a look at some of these other ideas and things that have that we've had shared as we scroll through our great questions here. Allison, how have you successfully navigated conversations about grammar and language teaching, whose position is that teaching grammar is inherently racist? That's a great question. And so we had a conversation about that at last year's ATEG conference. And there were a lot of different kinds of insights that were shared about that. What I would really recommend thinking about in terms of this is when approaching the idea of like teaching grammar is inherently racist, one thing to think about is the positionality that we take in teaching grammar. And if we can look at it as a way where grammatical concepts are different tools used for communication, well, then those can be tools that can be utilized in a variety of situations. But there certainly is a lot of validity to the position that teaching a very formulaic structure that doesn't value dialect, that doesn't value language variation, is inherently racist. So I think part of that conversation really does depend on the individual positionality. And I'd be thrilled to talk further about that. I know that can be a longer conversation. But another good question here, best practices can be used to leverage buy-in from educators who may not consider culturally relevant pedagogy valuable? I think that that's a fantastic question. I think as part of considering that, part of what we want to think about is, why might people not think that way? Why might people think that culturally relevant pedagogy isn't valuable? But and really encouraging them to do some of their own reflection and their own thinking about what it is that has led them to believe that, and what beliefs and what parts of their identity are kind of behind that position. But in terms of best practices that can be used to leverage it, one way, honestly, is to really think about the level of student engagement that we can get, and also all of those really important benefits that Mariem described at the beginning of our conversation today, and how all of those ideas and those the importance of those, how much that can really lead towards a conversation. But again, I know that that can, depending on the individual's positionality, can be something that can be a little bit challenging to sometimes get buy-in, but there is so much evidence, not only in terms of research, but also in terms of actual students' experiences that connect to that kinds of ideas.
And I just want to add on to that, like you said, if they don't think that it's valuable for whatever maybe biases, prejudices, then maybe going towards the route of the statistics and showing that there is a higher GPA for students who are part of this, and there is higher attendance levels and stuff like that. So maybe going towards the statistic route more if they're not seeing that like ethically it's more valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's such a great point, that there are different kinds of appeals we can use, but that is a really important one to think about, all those statistics that that Mariem described. A question from April: how much structure to provide in the grammar inquiry project? I understand it'll be class specific, but would you recommend giving students liberty to choose from any medium, or would you recommend 1 week looking at song lyrics, 1 week social media, etc.? I think that's a really good question. Well, you're right that it would be class specific, but I would still recommend giving students liberty to choose from as many possible mediums as they're comfortable with. I mean, certainly, sometimes things can be overwhelming if you say, okay, just pick whatever. But we might model or talk with them or think aloud with them about how you could look at song lyrics or social media or different kinds of things. But in terms of actually giving students opportunities to have different kinds of connections, I would really recommend giving them as wide of a range as possible. Another question: it's better to teach the effect of language as rhetoric to illustrate the dynamic of language instead of the inquiry to the students' lives. I think both approaches are certainly valuable, you can think about a rhetoric component of it, but I think the idea of having students engage in an authentic inquiry into language and text that they interact with can be really meaningful, because it builds off of a lot of insightful ideas about inquiry that are really prominent in and have a lot of, credence in education right now, but also I think is a really useful way to center students in the curriculum. Other questions here, and thanks to all of you for all of your great questions. What connections do you make with these assignments that demonstrate students are improving their writing skills? I often find, as a teacher of color who teaches Black and Brown students, the skills are not written or applied in written assignments. In fact, students are not held to the skills. My concern is, how are we ensuring that what society requires is taught and reflected in societal expectations outside of the school classroom? So I think that's a great question. I mean, I think that in terms of, helping students make those connections to their writing skills, so that project that we discussed, that's really the first step towards doing that. And then after students have reflected on these experiences, then they can think about utilizing those practices or those grammatical tools in their own writing. In other work I've done, I've actually written 3 books on teaching grammar, and the next extension to all of them, students reflecting on grammatical concepts, is then thinking about how they can apply them to their own writing, and once they use them in their writing, then do a reflection similar to what they did at the end of this project, where they think about, okay, when I wrote, one of the concepts or one of the grammatical tools I used was prepositional phrases or strong verbs or relative clauses? What kind of impact do they have on my writing? So just as students apply that analytical framework to the things that they examined, they can also apply that same kind of analytical framework toward what they write. Question from Brian here. Teachers describe SAE as a language of power when introducing grammar and language instruction. I wonder how students perceive this. What might be better language? That's a really good question. I would say that I feel like students would perceive it in exactly the way it's phrased, honestly. That like if you phrase something as the language of power, that's how they would perceive it. And I can think of many ways to phrase that as a better language. Mariem, what do you think about that idea?
I think power can be a little bit too strong
Yeah.
in cases and a little bit overwhelming for students, especially when we're talking about minority students. If it's a white teacher talking about power,
Right.
It can be a little bit off-putting and off-settling. I mean, obviously I don't have as much experience with this, but I think maybe saying like traditional English is used in a more professional setting, or that it just making it more situational instead of saying that it's power, because there's lots of people and celebrities, musicians, lots of people, politicians that use their AAVE, that have an accent, that use different dialects that are still powerful.
Right.
So I think it is a little bit dangerous to say that it is power, like that alone is power. When I don't think that's the case. Maybe back in the day that was the case, but I don't think in modern times that is as prevalent.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And and I think it's really powerful, it's really impactful to just look at, the way that, language really has that impact that Mariem is describing, and that there are so many different ways we can have a strong and impactful presence with language. So I think that's a great question. So a question from Dr. Ford. The Grammar Inquiry Project is clearly student-centered and it engages students in inquiry to study language in their everyday lives. What opportunities does the project afford for challenging the dominance of standard English, which are privileged in Common Core? How does the project challenge the status quo in terms of linguistic power dynamics? How does it create space for code meshing if all of the examples provided are from white mainstream English? Oh, so great questions there, and things that we can really get into in a great deal of depth, as in an even longer conversation. I'd be happy to engage further with that. But in terms of just addressing the questions of, I think that it's something that is a starting point for getting students to look at language and the ways that grammatical concepts they learn in school are featured in their everyday lives. And in terms of challenging the status quo, I think that's something that could be continued to develop as part of it. And it's something that, as we think about that, then we can then further ask students to think about, what do you notice about these different power dynamics? What are the differences between these different forms of language that you might see in one context versus another, or the way different grammatical tools are used in different kinds of situations? They could even do some even more in-depth contrastive analysis. And those could be some further questions or further inquiry that if one were to do a similar project again, that one could think of. The question from Joe here: I've always struggled in a self-reflective way. I hope to talk about how we talk about grammatical elements, like say prepositional phrases. In step 1 of Sean's project, the teacher shares example concepts and their significance. How do we use such terms about privilege and correctness as students encounter these terms for the first time? I think that's a great question. I think that one of the key ideas behind a project like this is really to demystify a lot of it, to not so much think about correctness as just to think about grammatical concepts as tools that authors use. And as part of understanding a tool, you do have to understand its features, but that's just part of the process of being able to identify them. And you can introduce the whole project to students and say, hey, part of the reason we're doing this is to look at examples of these concepts that we find. So when we think about these concepts, if we approach them as tools that authors use, I think it does take away some of the focus on correctness, because we're not saying, oh, this is the right way and this is the wrong way. You're just saying this is what this concept is. And then we can look for examples of it and think about concepts related to that. But thanks for all of those great questions. And key ideas and connections and issues. Connecting with the participants, certainly. I'm trying to think of the most user-friendly way to do that. In terms of connecting with the participants in today's session. However, if there's a specific way you would like to, just let me know. I do have everyone's email addresses. I hesitate to share email addresses without everyone's permission. But I guess one way to do it could be that if there's someone that you really want to connect with, or if you just want your email address shared with everyone, then you can email me and I can share the email addresses of those who give consent to have their email addresses shared. That could be one way to do that. But let me know if there's other ways I can help. And Bradley's looking into doing something for that. So thanks so much everyone for your participation in this. Really appreciate all of your insights and your ideas. Thanks to Mariem for all of her great work and sharing these insights. If you'd like to keep in touch with us, you see our contact information up there. You can tweet at us, you can email us, whatever you would like. And we really appreciate all of your ideas and insights. And remember, ATEG's webinars will continue, and you can go to ateg.weebly.com to sign up for more. So thanks everyone, have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.